Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, we're going to talk about panic attacks and by proxy anxiety attacks and differentiating that from what we have termed panic disorder. Now, this is important because panic attacks and anxiety attacks, we can all have those, but it does not mean we have a panic disorder or an anxiety disorder. Whereas, if someone is diagnosed with panic disorder, you will and have had panic attacks. So let's dig into this a little bit. First and foremost, let's talk a little bit about panic attacks and differentiating that from anxiety attacks. Now, I don't find the difference between these two wildly relevant. It can be helpful if you're trying to classify or trying to kind of understand the nature of a surge of anxiety or a surge of physiological symptoms, because, panic attacks and anxiety attacks, they both share this overwhelming, emotional and physiological experience, usually going to have some sort of impact on muscle tension, breathing, heart rate, those sorts of things. And it can look different for different folks, but in general, it is a heightened activation of the system that biologically, from a survival perspective, is appropriately sending cues to the brain saying, oh gosh, time to go into overdrive, time to go into fight or flight. The problem is there's usually not actually a threat at hand. Now, this segues into the difference between anxiety and panic attacks. The idea to me of anxiety attacks is more kind of a general diffuse experience, kind of a growing sense of anxiety that begins to overwhelm, whereas panic sounds exactly like the phrase sounds, panic. Sudden, quick, boom, in your face, overwhelming, and often is not necessarily triggered by something very unique or specific. Now, that's not always the case. Some people, they know what's going on. There's something that's triggering them. Over time, that anxiety builds. They have an anxiety attack. Other times, some trigger happens and boom, panic sets in right away. But panic is pretty notorious at times for not having a particular cause. The body suddenly throws itself into overdrive and you are left cognitively wondering what in the heck is going on. Now, this is already beginning to segue into a conversation about what is panic disorder, because a big piece of what constitutes panic disorder is that these panic attacks that somebody is experiencing are indeed unexpected. And this is part and parcel to why a very vicious cycle can form underneath panic disorder. But let's pause first, double check if there's anything else here on the panic attack or anxiety attack side. Yeah, I think especially if you're a provider listening, I think, mental health professional listening, I think it's really important to note that like panic attacks and anxiety attacks, this kind of lexicon, this language has entered the general public. And so people will describe this even when it doesn't necessarily apply to the severity or degree that we commonly associate with panic attacks and anxiety attacks. There's a giant relativity. Now, the one I hear more often is an anxiety attack, and that's a more appropriate generalized term, as I alluded to earlier, in the sense that, we can all have these attacks of anxiety, or, anxiety can build to a point to where it can overwhelm us and inhibit and kind of infringe upon our ability to perform or engage as we typically might. Some people will say, though, I'm having an anxiety attack or panic attack just because they're feeling something that feels tense or overwhelming. Now, there is subjectivity to this. Some people's distress tolerance for anxiety is quite low, and so a small level of anxiety for them subjectively might truly feel like some sort of overwhelming inner impulse that they cannot control or manage. However, very frequently, there is this sort of like overextension. It represents almost like a hyperbole of just somebody who's having a lot of anxiety. That's not necessarily an anxiety attack or, oh gosh, something is very heavy in this moment, I'm having an anxiety attack. It's like, well, okay, you're having anxiety, but it's not necessarily an anxiety attack. Why is this important? I mean, people are entitled to say whatever they want to say to describe their experience, but as a provider, I always want to hear like, well, what does an anxiety attack look like to you? Or what does a panic attack look like to you? What symptoms are there? How long does it last? Like most interviewing that I do, I tend to remain open-ended because I want to hear what someone spontaneously says first. I don't want to be filling in the blanks for them and letting them say yes or no. What's most pressing, and then I fill in the blanks later. And this will be helpful for differentiating between more severe or kind of, if you think of the traditional understanding of it like a bona fide, I'm not trying to invalidate, but to a more severe bona fide anxiety or panic attack versus a more colloquial use of the term just describing anxiety in general, that, heaven forbid, the world can stress us and we can feel overwhelmed at times. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like in my kind of telescoping out existential challenge to society right now is, like, as much as it's nice that we're increasing our language for how we describe mental health ailments and difficulties, it would be better for us to be more precise than we're being right now. We it feels like the general public has attached itself to various terms and made it into this wildly broad, extremely relative, concept or concepts, which does a disservice to really delineating and understanding the difference between one end of the spectrum from another end of the spectrum. And so I wish we would be a little bit more careful and mindful about the use of the term anxiety and panic attack, just as, for the general public's sake, but also for providers to truly understand the difference between the two and not have to probe so much. But that's my social kind of commentary thing, is I feel like we increasingly drift towards relativism, and us providers are kind of caught in this, kind of gray zone lurch very frequently with people. So let's get back to panic disorder. Dominant to panic disorder, the essential diagnostic feature is fear. And it is essentially fear of the panic attacks recurring. Panic attacks are extremely severe. I mean, they really are. They are jarring. And if you've ever experienced one, they can be so severe from a physiological perspective that sometimes people are presenting to a hospital concerned that they're having heart issues or a heart attack, rather than actually attaching it to anxiety at first. And so these are extremely overwhelming experiences, and very naturally they are so distinct and so overwhelming that it elicits a fear response. You don't want to have that happen again, because it's like, oh, that was not fun. And my ability to function went down substantially when I had that panic attack. And so naturally fear enters the fray. Now, that initial fear response is completely normal. What is really important, and diagnostically, the diagnostic manual actually does a pretty good job with time specifiers, is that fear response sustains over time. We're not talking like just a few weeks. We're talking weeks and weeks, if not months, of this problem, of this fear-based response. And this fear response begins to inhibit behavior longitudinally. The person becomes afraid of going out into public and doing their typical routines because they're afraid that this panic attack is going to recur. Now, there's another really important qualifier here. And you might be even asking yourself, like, why is there such a fear response? Like, okay, it was unpleasant. Why can't somebody move past that? Well, the second aspect that makes it so challenging is that the panic attack often occurs in an unexpected manner, and in some cases straight up out of the blue. Our brains naturally try to attach meaning and causality to things. It's just kind of how we work. It's how we're bred from a very young age. X to Y, A to B to C. That's what we're always looking for. So when you pair something that is extremely overwhelming and somatically is cueing your primal fight or flight state, again, very significantly, and you juxtapose that with an unpredictability, that is a recipe for disaster. The brain does not like that combination, and it makes it really hard to rectify and move through, like, oh my gosh, what was that, and am I going to be okay? For people who end up developing panic disorder, they're essentially like, that was unexpected and overwhelming and terrifying, and I don't want that to happen again. They become very nervous and very tense. The challenge here, and the sad irony, the kind of Shakespearean tragedy of it all, I don't know if it's Shakespearean, but the very fear of the panic attack begins to infuse them with even more anxiety that increases the likelihood of subsequent panic attacks. It's like they become hyper focused on their body and sensations, and that worsens the outcomes. And then lo and behold, when another panic attack occurs, it's see, I knew there was something to fear, and it just feeds right back into this cycle of fear. And this is where panic disorder begins to form, this vicious feedback loop of extreme anxiety and fear about something recurring when it recurs unexpectedly, seemingly unattached to anything, minus the fact that these people tend to be hypersensitive and hypervigilant after the initial one. Then it feeds right back into the system. And it's why it's very hard to break this cycle. You're again, a snake that eats its own tail. It is not a fun cycle to break. And really important from a treatment perspective is essentially management of and psychoeducation about, so that when a panic attack inevitably recurs, which it often does, sometimes folks are lucky and it won't recur. It only happens once or twice and goes away. But if they're like once or twice they're coming in and they're afraid of it recurring, we're not supposed to try to prevent it totally from recurring. We want to educate and try to equip people with skills to mitigate the likelihood, if not mitigate the severity of it when it does. But we're also tending to the perception of what the panic attack is, because the brain is contributing to this cycle. The brain colludes with the body and saying, this is horrible, this is unredeemable, this is too overwhelming for me to manage. Was what we're teaching people is the brain sort of counterbalancing the body. The body will say, as it naturally does, panic, 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 overwhelmed, saber-toothed tiger is chasing me. And the brain, through therapy and education, says like, hold on. I hear you. Thank you for the cue. Thank you for alerting me. However, I am okay. This is not an extreme situation. You are safe enough, etc., etc. And that helps kind of interrupt the cycle a little bit. But notice how distinct panic disorder is. Lots of people who have panic attacks and or anxiety attacks in their life do not end up developing panic disorder. And it is very noteworthy if you've ever had a panic attack or an anxiety attack. It could recur or it might never recur. But it's not unusual for them to kind of space out, that there will be a period where there's more of these kind of bodily, like a rocket ships taken off real quick, and then it subsides. A quick little caveat before we end is we understand there are people who are more anxiously inclined. There are even genetic questions about inheritability of greater degrees of anxiety. We're all capable of it, but we don't all experience anxiety to the equal degree. And so folks who are more predisposed to anxiety can be more predisposed to the development of anxiety attacks and panic attacks. And that's not to, sound doom and gloom. It's more just like, again, preparation. If you know yourself to be more anxious and you tend to be more of a worrier, or you just kind of hyper tuned to your environment, it's good to get ahead of this and say, like, if I ever do, how do I educate myself about anxiety? Because if I ever have one of these attacks, I need, I could be better equipped to manage it and deal with it, because I'm already, worried enough and anxious enough in life. So I might as well equip myself with education about it, as well as ways to cope and manage thereafter. As a side note, the psychodynamic folks would argue that some of these folks who are chronically anxious and very existentially anxious actually represent a personality. Aspect of someone's personality, an anxious personality. But that is a digression that I will save for another episode. So hopefully helpful. Just a quick, very brief overview of anxiety and panic attacks. You're welcome to look up the symptoms online. It's not terribly exciting, so I'm not going to present those here. And then how does that and when does that develop into panic disorder, and what does that include? So as ever, I hope this has been helpful and interesting. And as always, stay curious.